Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Happy Earth Day. Thanks for having me here tonight. This is a great event, and I'm really excited that you've done your first big event here for Earth Day, so it's very exciting. Keep doing it. I'll come back if you want. Let's see. I wanted to talk about a lot of things. I don't want to take up all night, so I'm going to get my phone out and watch the time. But it's complicated because I want to tell you about what's going on in Pennsylvania. I want to talk to you about fracking, and I want to tie it into climate change. So it's not a lot to cover in a few minutes, so wish me luck. The phrase that we like to say, and Josh Fox, among others, have said it, is that natural gas is not a bridge fuel to Gangplank. And that's definitely our experience in Pennsylvania. So what you're seeing here is an animation that comes from Penn State University. And as those colors fill in, what you're looking at is the number of unconventional wells that have been permitted in Pennsylvania over the past decade or so. They put the first well into the ground, the first unconventional well, back in 2003. So what you're seeing there is what Pennsylvania is starting to look like. We don't have all of those wells in the ground yet. We have 9,030 that have been drilled. This is 16,078 that have been permitted. So it's spoken for land. And so what you can see here is that some of those northern tier counties, for example, you can't even make out the counties anymore for the dots. And what's significant about that is that as you're contemplating that number, 16,078, that's a fraction of what the industry wants to put into Pennsylvania. They're looking to put in over 100,000 wells. So imagine what the state's going to look like if they do exactly what they intend to do. Now, in my part of the state, I'm down in that southeastern quadrant. We're spared the worst of all of the drilling. We have infrastructure projects in our area, just like you have around here. But in the part of the state where the Marcellus exists, in the part of the state in the western part and into eastern Ohio where the Utica Shale exists in a productive way, we have lots of dry gas, too dry to drill under us, but farther west you go, it's very productive. You can even go for oil as far west as Pittsburgh and that part of the state. So in those parts of the state, that's where you're going to see those 100,000 wells. The same communities are going to be slammed over and over and over again, and they just can't take it. I mean, there are already communities in Pennsylvania where they can't drink their water. There's a town or an area in Butler County, which is in the southwestern part of the state, where the community called the Woodlands, 30 families are standing online at a church to get clean water from volunteers, and they've been doing it for 4 years. Because the government's not taking accountability, and the industry is certainly not taking any sort of responsibility. And so that's what we're dealing with in Pennsylvania. And so I just wanted to talk to you briefly about fracking and water a little bit, because I want to talk to you about certainly methane, the other carbon, in a minute, but you have to kind of understand the fracking process and the impact that it has on water, because that's actually what got me into it. I came for the water, I stayed for the climate. And so, the water issues are tremendous in Pennsylvania. We use about 4.3 million gallons of water per fracking. And so what a fracking is a hydraulic fracturing process where you inject millions of gallons of water into the earth at a very, very high pressure, so high that you will fracture the shale. Now, what makes it significant, the industry loves to say that it's been around for decades, it's 60 years old. Well, it is. Hydraulic fracturing is 60 years old, but this is not your father or grandfather's hydraulic fracturing we're talking about. And what makes it different and what makes it unconventional drilling as opposed to conventional drilling is now the new wells are now drilled down several thousand feet and then over up to 2 miles. So they can go horizontally into the shale for up to 2 miles. And that takes a lot of water, but it also takes a lot of additives, because when you put the water into a not so big hole, very, very high pressure, and it has to travel that kind of distance with enough force to crack open the shale, the water causes so much of its own friction that it slows down the process. And so they have to lubricate the water. And so what has happened over the past years is that hydraulic fracturing, the old technology, has come together with newer technologies like horizontal drilling, like this additive slick water. The other one is multi-well pad construction, where they can put multiple well pads onto multiple wells onto one well pad, so that the danger there is that if something goes wrong with one, they communicate with one another, now you've got a much bigger problem. So those technologies came together to make what we call unconventional drilling that is all tied into shale gas development. We still have plenty of conventional wells. That map you saw at the beginning doesn't count those. There are tens of thousands of those. But back to this first slide quickly. So you have the water issue up front, because that water that you're putting into the well, you're not just adding lubricants to it, you're adding all sorts of things. You're adding proppants, like sand. So they actually use a proppant to prop open the shale, like propping open a door, to allow the gas to keep coming out, and it does. And it brings with it everything else that was safely encapsulated in the shale for all these years. And so now we have other things coming to the surface in addition to the water that comes back out of the process with all of those additives that were added. Some of them are highly toxic chemicals, some of them are surfactants, some of them are biocides. They use a lot of biocides. There are about 40 different categories of chemicals. We know more about the categories than we know about the chemicals themselves, because the industry is not required to disclose what they're using. And so that's a big issue when you're trying to figure out not only what's going in, but what's happening when it meets up with what's coming out. We just don't know, and we certainly don't know what quantities of these chemicals they're using. We know some from independent testing, and that's how I know some of them are carcinogenic. We know some from voluntary disclosure, but some of the voluntary disclosure we've gotten from this industry is to say, oh, it's the kind of chemicals we use in ice cream and gummy bears. I'll show you the list sometime. I don't think you'll want any ice cream or gummy bears that contains any of that. So that's problem one. That water that went in is consumptively used. It's never going to be used again. It's removed from the water cycle. That's huge. But then, what do you do with all that waste? So now we have all the waste that's coming out of the system. We don't know how to dispose of it. And then the third problem is that we have all of this water and methane, pardon me, when the water comes to the surface, the methane is separated. That's the natural gas. That's the main ingredient of natural gas. It's separated. It's shipped off for transmission, I'll get to in a moment. But when it comes up the well, there are pathways that methane itself can take to get right into the water supply, because there are sort of inherent failures built into the system that I can talk about in Q&A. I won't go into it all now because it takes a little time. But there are ways in which the fracking process itself, in other words, can cause contamination. So we have contaminated water being created all the time, hard to dispose of, and now we've got all of this water and methane coming to the surface and little pathways for the methane and the other contaminants to make it into groundwater. And it has happened. We have 256 wells, at least in Pennsylvania, that the DEP admits to that have been contaminated. So that's a water setup I just wanted to go through quickly, because the other thing that happens to some of that methane that rides up alongside the well is that it makes it into the air. Now, we keep hearing about how clean natural gas is. Even President Obama cheerleads natural gas, which makes me kind of crazy. But I call the methane problem methane trifecta. So first of all, natural gas isn't clean burning, it's cleaner burning, only about by half. So when you burn it, you're still contributing carbon dioxide to the problem. Methane is an invisible threat. This is a tank on a clear sunny day, but if you use a FLIR camera, it's an infrared camera, this is what you see. And so there's an awful lot of emissions, and that's not all methane, but it's all sorts of VOCs and things that come off of every part of the infrastructure. And so it's not just that you're using it as a fuel and it's cleaner burning, but that's not good enough in these scant years that we have left to deal with climate change. That's, I still think, is a problem. We shouldn't be using any of it. But the methane itself is a huge problem because of how frequently it leaks. Here's just a quick chart coming from the EPA, which isn't the best agency to rely on for accurate data. They used to not take methane that seriously with respect to oil and gas drilling. They used to not consider it in their greenhouse gas inventory because they didn't think it was a significant leakage rate. But now they found that it's quite different. So now you see that there's an awful lot of methane that's lost along the way at every point along the process. And when it hits the atmosphere in that raw form, it is 86 times more powerful in these 20 years we have left to deal with it. I want to very quickly show you orphan and abandoned wells. We always talk about how it's leaking along the product life cycle. This is going beyond the grave. We have hundreds of thousands of wells in Pennsylvania that have been orphaned and abandoned, and they are leaking. And so there's actually a local researcher, Mary Kang from here in Princeton, who just did a big study on orphan and abandoned wells and found out that what she discovered was that they are super emitters of methane. And she worked with a friend of mine named Laurie Barr, who took these photos that you're looking at. This is the condition you find these wells in when you discover them. And so now we have all these wells that have been not attended to. Every new well going in is adding to that legacy, and that's a huge problem because we don't have a handle on how to deal with that. This gives you an idea why. That's an old oil and gas map for 4 municipalities in 1 county. And all those dots you see there are either oil wells or gas wells, and every one of them needs to be attended to and haven't been. We have up to 900,000 in the state. They all need attention. So the third piece, very quickly, is that pardon me, methane doesn't stick around in the atmosphere forever. It's considered a short-lived greenhouse gas, and that's because it only sticks around for about a decade. When it goes away, it doesn't really go away, it converts. It meets up with hydroxides and converts into carbon dioxide, so you can't get away from it. I just wanted to get back to the fracking and the intersection with the water, because one of the things that concerns me greatly is when President Obama gave his climate talk, he opened with examples of shrinking snowpack and people down the mountain not knowing where they're going to get their water. And he talked about record drought, like we're seeing in California now. I mean, in California, they're still fracking. The industry has not been stopped. In Pennsylvania, we have 27 counties under a drought watch. They're still fracking, every one of those counties. In fact, in the week that they announced that drought watch in Pennsylvania, they issued 50 more permits. And so you're looking at how little water we're really dealing with. You can't keep taking water out of the system. You can't keep contaminating clean water because you dumped dirty water too close to it. You can't keep letting methane making its way up through the shale, contaminating private water supplies. You just can't do it. It's not sustainable. And so here to end, I wanted to show you very quickly this chart that comes from a report from an organization called Ceres, where they look at water stress and fracking. And now they're not trying to make that causation factor that says that, the fracking caused the water stress, but they're looking at places where there already is water stress and fracking going on. And there's a high correlation that in these places that are already experiencing high to extremely high water stresses, having insufficient water supplies or problems with drought, that's where they're doing fracking. I think it was 47% are in areas that are high or extremely high water stress areas. And so I'll just close by saying, this is everybody's NIMBY issue. We need to take to the streets. You fight pipelines here. I help with the Penn East pipeline, among others. That's the kind of thing that you could be doing to spare not only yourselves and the planet, but Pennsylvanians who are unfortunately the canaries in the gas well. Thank you.